Welcome. My name is Julie Lesnick. I'm an anthropologist at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, and I'm here today to answer your questions about why we don't eat insects in Western culture. So first off, to look at this map, was compiled in 2012 and reflects the number of insects consumed in each country. And so by Western culture, I'm referring to Europe and the countries like ours here in the United States, as well as Canada, that have a great influence from Europe, from colonization and continued immigration. So that's what I'm using as Western culture today. And so you can see in these areas that yes, there's a couple of European countries to the south that have some recording of edible insects, as well as us here in the United States. But for the most part, these countries are left blank. Throughout Europe, Canada is left blank, and the ones that are colored in are in the lightest, only 1 to 5 species. And so this map reflects what we sort of generally think about where insects are consumed around the world. We see it much more in Mexico, in China, throughout Central Africa, and much more absent up in these regions up here. So the question today then is, why don't we eat insects in these more northern countries up here that we're calling Western culture? And so if you were to ask somebody here in the United States why they don't eat insects, they'd probably say something along the lines of, they're disgusting. And so the thing is this isn't a great answer, because we know, I just showed you in that map previously, we know they are consumed around the world. So there can't be something inherent about the bugs themselves that make them disgusting, because they are palatable to billions of people. Another answer that you might find if you've been looking is that they're viewed as pests to our agricultural crops. And so it's thought that when people were primarily hunter-gatherers, they might have been eating a lot of insects, but as soon as we domesticated plants and began agricultural practices, insects were more problematic, they were pests, we started stigmatizing, having negative associations with them, and stopped consuming them. However, in the map of all of those countries, of the people around the world who do eat insects, those populations are agricultural as well. And so that doesn't seem to be a satisfying answer. And so I'm here to kind of give you a perspective from anthropology. So anthropology is the study of humankind. We use it in many different ways because humans are so complex. And so we kind of have to look at people from multiple perspectives to really understand what's going on. And so two of these perspectives might be through looking at our biology as well as our culture. And so you may have heard of the nature versus nurture debate, but the truth is that it's not an either or situation. A lot of what we do is influenced by both our nature and our nurture, by both our biology and our culture. And so to really understand humans, we have to implement kind of both perspectives. And so from the biology perspective, this is my area of study primarily, and there's a famous quote from a geneticist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, that says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution." And so looking at our biological connections with edible insects, it's kind of important to think about it evolutionarily. And so when we're looking at it from an evolution perspective, we're thinking about what were our ancestors doing, but also what are our closest living relatives doing today? And those are members of the primates. So our primate cousins, many of them eat insects, but not all of them. And so if you're a primatologist studying primate behavior, you would approach this question about why a group of primates may eat insects while another doesn't by looking at a bunch of factors that affects their food choices. So this might be how big they are, what their nutritional needs are, what other foods are available in their environment, what foods do they eat. And so a lot of this has to do with what we call their ecology, all of the interactions between them and other plants and animals given their environment. And so if we're looking at the biological basis of edible insects in our primate cousins, what we're looking at is their environment. And so we can look at the human environment as well. If we're going to try to understand the biological perspective of why people don't eat insects in certain regions, the environment plays a major role. So the thing with humans, with the human species, is that we colonized all of the world, right? We've reached as far north into the Arctic as you possibly can, as well as have inhabited some of the warmest climates down in the tropics. And so what you see in these images is the snowy environment of more northern latitudes like the Arctic, and then more kind of jungle rainforest environment of living at the equator. And so people have made lives for themselves in both of these areas. And so just immediately looking at these images, if you're going to think, oh, who of them would be eating insects, you would think the people on the right would more likely eat insects because they're not going to be available in the snow to the people on the left. And so this is an updated map from the one I showed you before, and you can see it's a lot more colored in. However, there may still be sort of that pattern, right? We're not seeing a lot of insect eating in European countries. Canada's now colored in, the United States is a little darker, but the darkest countries are still Mexico and China. We got a lot going on in Central Africa. And so if you put in the equator as well as the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, which caps off the tropics of the globe, you can see that most of the countries within the tropics are filled in, and then the ones outside of the tropics seem to be less likely to have insect eating as part of their diet. And so this is something that kind of follows this pattern known as the latitudinal diversity gradient. It's a well-recognized phenomenon in ecology whereby species richness is much greater at the equator, and as you get further and further away from the equator, this number of species or species diversity reduces. So there's not a single explanation. It's probably a combination of a couple of things, but basically at the equator you have more consistent sunlight year-round. With more consistent sunlight you have more energy for plants to photosynthesize. With more plants you can then support other species. Additionally, the seasonality at the equator is much different than it is at northern latitudes. So where we are in the northern part of the United States, you get very harsh winters, and in the tropics, you have seasons, you have wet seasons, you have stormy seasons, but you don't get that harsh, snowy covered winter down there. So that probably lets species diversity maintain itself year round. And so I kind of wanted to test to see if the reason people eat insects more in the tropics is because of their environment, right? Does insect eating actually correlate with your latitude? Are you more likely to eat insects in the tropics based entirely on latitude alone? So I did a study and I looked at number of insect species consumed in each country, looked at the centroid latitude, so just basically rough position of the country on the globe, but also looked at variables like the percentage of arable land. So the percentage of arable land is the amount of land that is farmed. And so this is to test that idea that agriculture reduces insect consumption. So the more land that is used for plants or domesticated animals, you should see less insect consumption. That's how we can test that hypothesis. I also looked at population density because maybe people are only eating insects when population sizes are getting so large that they're outstripping their other resources. So this is this idea that insects would be a fallback food. And then I also looked at gross domestic product in order to test whether insects are only consumed in poorer countries who might not have access to other more preferred resources. And so, I'll leave you, I'll spare you the details of the statistics, but basically what I found is that the model that I used, a logistic regression, found that latitude could correctly predict the presence of edible insects 80% of the time. So only knowing where on the globe a country is, 80% of the time you could say yes or no, they have edible insects present. And so the other variables that I looked at did not show this correlation. So therefore, I've refuted the sort of idea of insects as a fallback food or as a reduction in insects due to increase in agriculture. So really, there seems to be a very strong environmental component. And so this has led me to my sort of latitude and attitude hypothesis, what I call it. And so basically, if we think about human evolution, this biological component keeping evolution part of there, people were in Europe until about 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago maybe, and basically that was the Pleistocene in that Europe would have been a very cold environment for a good part of the year. And it wasn't until about 18,000 years ago that we had the last glacial maximum. And so it's only been recently that we haven't had continual glacial cover in Europe and Canada and the northern part of the United States. And so during most of the kind of history of people in these regions, insects would not have been a very good option. And so it hasn't been until recently that insects maybe could have been adopted into our diets here, maybe seasonally, but you can see that maybe we don't have the best history set up based on where we're from. But the next thing I want to talk about is culture, because the environment can explain why edible insects are uncommon in northern latitudes, right? We don't have a deep history that includes them as a possible resource even, but it does not explain why we have such a strong aversion to them, why we find them disgusting. And so this brings me to the point, to major points in anthropology known as ethnocentrism and othering. So people, we have a tendency to evaluate our perceptions of other cultures based on our own values and standards and customs of our own culture. And so that's what's called ethnocentrism. To think that something that is different than how we do it is automatically worse, that's an ethnocentric perspective. And this is very common. People do it all the time. As anthropologists, we're trained to be very aware of this and to avoid it, because if we're going to try to understand people and people from all around the world, we need to understand them from their own perspective, from their own values. But that doesn't come naturally. It is very natural to other people. And so that's this other concept, this tendency to place ourselves in the center of our thoughts, and that anyone on the outside is the other people. And so they are often kind of thought of as inferior, or their ways of life are different than ours, and we generally don't speak as positively about things that are different from from ourselves, because we're defensive that what we do has reason and that how we do things is the right way. And so these are two things that people do all the time. And so if we're talking about why we don't eat insects in Western culture, well, the one thing that unites Western culture is Europe. And so we really have to look at European history. And so it is, what unites Western culture is, yes, Europe, but also the countries that have been colonized, have been conquered, have had continual immigrations from European countries. And so in Europe, we know that they were covered in ice until about 18,000 years ago, and so it's been only more in our recent history, evolutionarily speaking, that insects would be a viable option, and they were not eating them. But now we can think of the age of exploration, where all of a sudden it's possible to get on a boat and travel across the world and see environments that are unlike anything you've ever seen before. And then you come across people that are living in these environments and doing things differently than you could ever imagine. And so one of the things that people encountered on these European explorations were people in the tropics eating insects. And so we can look first to Columbus. Now, Columbus never set foot on the land that we call the United States today, but his expedition to the Caribbean then initiated continual explorations of what they called the New World, because of his success, and so they continued to explore. So a quote from somebody that was a companion of Columbus on his second voyage, he talked about how the indigenous people they encountered, he said they eat all the snakes and lizards and spiders and worms that they find upon the ground, so that to my fancy their bestiality is greater than that of any beast upon the face of the earth. And so you can see that Tjanka here is using othering, is using ethnocentrism. He's putting his values of European culture onto these people they encountered during this exploration, and calling these people who eat foods differently than Europeans do, he's calling them beast-like. And that set a tone for the behaviors of indigenous people to automatically be considered inferior to those in European civilization. And like I said, the Columbus expeditions then initiated continual explorations. And so a quote from, a couple of decades later from the Narvaez expedition, we now see that he writes that now and then they kill deer and at times get a fish. But this is so little and their hunger so great that they eat spiders and ant eggs, worms, lizards and salamanders and serpents, also vipers, the bite of which is deadly. So again, saying the only reason he could ever imagine that somebody could ever want to eat an insect or a worm or a lizard would be that they are starving, that their hunger is so great. And again, this devalues their customs and their culture, that these were just foods that, to them. But the European perspective is that you would never eat these insects or these other foods unless you were starving. And so this is part of our history in Western culture, and these concepts, these ideas, these perspectives still persist today. So Jared Diamond is an author of a very famous book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he's explaining kind of the spread of Western civilization. And he says, what cries out for explanation is the failure of food production to appear until modern times in some ecologically very suitable areas that are among the world's richest centers of agriculture and herding today. Foremost among these puzzling areas, where indigenous people were still hunter-gatherers when European colonists arrived, were California and other Pacific states of the United States, the Argentine Pampas, southwestern and southeastern Australia, and much of the Cape region of South Africa. So again, Jared Diamond is not looking at the hunter-gatherer customs that were there prior to European contact as a completely reasonable way to use your resources and support your family. Instead, he thinks it's puzzling that they wouldn't adopt agriculture, or what he thinks is clearly superior, because it's how Europeans do it. But just because it's how the Europeans do it doesn't mean it's better. And if you live in an environment where it can naturally support you without having to put the energy into tending crops, why wouldn't you do that? And so that is a less ethnocentric perspective, is to value the hunter-gatherer way of life for what it was. So one of the biggest things that's happened for edible insects in the most recent years is in 2013, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization published a statement regarding how insects can be a better food source, more sustainable, and lead to better food security if we're all eating more insects. And so even in that statement, they cite Jared Diamond, who I just quoted to you, but they look at the history of, of Europe and the fact we don't eat insects here in those same sort of ethnocentric perspectives. So the domestication of large animals and plants gave Europeans a considerable advantage over other regions, as evidenced by their worldwide conquests. And so again, that's using this sort of ethnocentric, that what Europeans do was superior, as opposed to looking, so it's actually positively spinning that European conquests were because they had advantage, because they had superior culture, instead of accepting the fact that conquests are a horrible part of our history, right? The fact that Europeans came to lands like the United States, took indigenous people into slavery, murdered a lot of them, moved them to reservations, and basically ruined their lives. Instead of taking responsibility for that, this statement is still saying that the Europeans were superior, so clearly that sort of thing is going to happen. And that doesn't take responsibility and changes our how we talk about history, and changes it to make us look better. And that's, an important thing that I wanted to share with you, because it's actually these sort of negative interactions of Europeans with indigenous people during the Age of Exploration that is why we do not see edible insects in our culture today, because they have long been stigmatized. And so the places where Europeans had conquered, you start seeing a dramatic reduction of insect eating in those regions. And so it's really important, if we're going to try to promote edible insects going forward, it's really important to remember these things. That gross and disgusting is culturally determined. And there is nothing about insects that makes them naturally gross. It has a big, it's all tied up in their cultural history. Also, meat is not inherently better than insects in all settings. Hunting meat is a risky endeavor. If you can get all you need from foraging for smaller animal foods instead of hunting for big game, that is a much more safe, predictable resource, and would make a lot of sense. So just because we had to hunt in Europe in order to survive, because there was no plant matter and no small game really available in the harsh winter months, doesn't mean that meat itself is superior all over the world. But although there are these important cultural aspects, there are environmental components. So edible insects were never as prominent in northern latitudes as they are in the tropics. And so a lot of why we don't have insect eating in these northern regions in Western culture is because our environments were never very well suited for it to begin with. So I hope this answers your question. The latitude and attitude hypothesis is in this paper in the American Journal of Human Biology, and a lot of my ideas about European colonization will be available in my book in 2018, Edible Insects and Human Evolution. Thanks for listening.